On a sunlit morning, Marcus Carter walked through the bustling downtown, his steps slow but purposeful. A black man in his late 50s, Marcus was a retired Army veteran with a quiet strength, his face lined with the marks of service and sacrifice. Despite his calm demeanor, he carried a quiet joy as he approached a jewelry store, hoping to find something special for his son Isaiah's upcoming graduation. The store was a quaint place he'd been to before, filled with sparkling gems and fine jewelry behind glass displays that caught the light just right. As Marcus entered the store, he was met with a sense of optimism. The air was warm, the atmosphere peaceful, and he greeted the store owner, Mr. Lang, a man he vaguely recognized. Marcus knew he didn't need much, just a small token that would convey the pride he felt for Isaiah. Isaiah had been through a lot, training as a boxer to channel his energy and focus his mind, a path Marcus had always supported. Today was about honoring that effort, the journey they'd both been on, and as he browsed, Marcus allowed himself to savor the moment. The store, however, was not entirely welcoming. Mr. Lang, who had been arranging a display, noticed Marcus and seemed to stiffen slightly. Though polite, he kept a close eye on Marcus, his gaze lingering with an unspoken wariness. Nearby, a young woman named Sophia moved quietly around the displays, glancing occasionally at Marcus. Her presence felt peculiar, a bit too convenient, as though she were watching for something other than the jewelry. As Marcus examined a silver bracelet that caught his eye, Mr. Lang moved closer, his stance becoming more protective of his displays. His subtle tension didn't escape Marcus's notice, but he chose to ignore it, focusing instead on finding the perfect gift for Isaiah. He knew that as a black man, there were places where his presence would always be questioned. But today was supposed to be a day of peace, of celebration, and he was determined not to let prejudice overshadow it. Just as Marcus was preparing to make his purchase, Mr. Lang's face shifted from wary to panicked. His gaze darted toward an empty spot in the jewelry case, and he straightened up, his eyes narrowing at Marcus. "Sir," Mr. Lang said, his voice edged with accusation, "one of our diamond rings is missing. I'm going to need to check your pockets." His voice carried an undertone that was unmistakable, his words laced with an implicit distrust. Marcus was taken aback, his surprise giving way to a feeling of disbelief. "I haven't taken anything," he said calmly, holding his hands up to show he was carrying nothing but his wallet. He kept his tone even, though a hint of irritation crept in. He could feel the judgment radiating from Mr. Lang, and he knew what this was truly about. He'd experienced this kind of prejudice before, but it still stung each time. Before Marcus could fully process the accusation, the sound of heavy boots echoed through the store. Officer Kent, a tall, intimidating man with a hard, expressionless face, had arrived on the scene. Kent had a reputation for his harsh tactics, and his gaze landed on Marcus with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. Rather than assessing the situation impartially, Kent locked eyes with Marcus, immediately assuming him to be guilty. "What's going on here?" Kent asked, his tone sharp. Mr. Lang wasted no time explaining, pointing directly at Marcus. "This man took one of my diamond rings," he said, with a conviction that left no room for doubt. Kent's expression hardened further, and he stepped closer to Marcus, his posture aggressive. Without a word of inquiry or any effort to understand, Kent reached out and grabbed Marcus by the arm, his grip unrelenting. "Empty your pockets," he demanded. Marcus, maintaining his composure, pulled his pockets out, revealing they were empty. "I didn't take anything," he repeated, his voice calm but strained. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, but inside, his dignity was under attack. He was a veteran, a man who had served his country, and yet, in this moment, he was being reduced to a common thief without a shred of evidence. But Kent wasn't satisfied. Ignoring Marcus's dignity, he began to pat him down roughly, treating him as though he were already convicted. Sophia, the young woman from earlier, watched silently, her gaze unreadable. She had slipped away from the store counter moments before the accusation, and her presence now felt like a strange twist of fate. Marcus couldn't help but wonder if her involvement in this situation was more than it appeared, but he had no time to dwell on it. The more Marcus protested his innocence, the more Kent's treatment escalated. Kent seemed to relish the opportunity, his frustration and prejudice channeled into his every action. Each word Marcus spoke only seemed to fuel Kent's aggression, as though his calmness was a challenge. And finally, without warning, Kent's anger boiled over. He raised his fist and punched Marcus hard in the face, sending him sprawling to the ground. The blow was so sudden, so violent, that the world went dark around Marcus. Unbeknownst to him, Kent's rage had consequences that extended far beyond that single act. The punch left Marcus lying on the floor, his consciousness slipping away as he fell into a coma. The once bright morning turned dark, the optimism of the day shattered, replaced by a sense of injustice that hung heavy in the air. Marcus lay unconscious, unaware that his world, and the world of his son, was about to be changed forever. But the story was far from over. At the police station, Marcus was dragged through the cold, fluorescent-lit halls by Officer Kent and a pair of junior officers who barely exchanged a word. His limp body bore bruises and scrapes, but his spirit, though battered, remained unbroken. Yet, under the harsh lights of the station, he became just another suspect, stripped of his dignity and humanity, reduced in their eyes to nothing more than an accusation. Kent's hand pressed down on Marcus's shoulder as he forced him into a holding cell, the door slamming shut behind him. Inside the cell, Marcus's mind churned. He'd been in intense situations before during his service, moments where fear and tension ran high, but nothing had felt as hopeless as this. Here he was, in his own hometown, in a police station where he was treated like a criminal rather than a veteran, and a father who had simply wanted to buy a gift for his son. Memories of his years of service flashed through his mind. The sacrifices, the friends lost, the battles he'd fought, all seemingly for nothing, if this was the life he returned to. Meanwhile, Officer Kent, filled with a sense of self-righteousness, was talking to another officer in the hallway. "He didn't even put up a fight, but I could tell he was lying," Kent muttered, his words dripping with disdain. "Guys like him always think they can get away with it. He had it coming." The other officers, though silent, nodded in unspoken agreement, accustomed to Kent's tirades and aware of his notorious reputation. Marcus's son, Isaiah, was just finishing his morning workout at a local gym when he received a call from a friend who had heard about the arrest. He dropped the weights, his heart racing, and left the gym immediately, ignoring the coach's calls to finish his set. Isaiah's mind spun with worry and anger, unable to understand how his father could have ended up in such a situation. His father was the most honorable man he knew, a man who had raised him with a strict moral code, a man who had given everything to his country and his family. By the time Isaiah reached the police station, he was filled with a burning urgency to see his father, to know that he was safe. But as soon as he stepped into the lobby, his path was blocked by Officer Kent. Kent recognized Isaiah instantly, his jaw tightening as he sized him up, a young, fit black man with the same resilience he'd seen in Marcus. Kent didn't care for Isaiah's explanations or pleas to see his father. To Kent, Isaiah was merely an extension of his father, another troublemaker in his eyes. "You here to cause trouble too?" Kent sneered, his arms crossed as he blocked Isaiah's path. Isaiah clenched his fists, swallowing down the surge of anger that threatened to overwhelm him. He'd learned to control his emotions in the boxing ring, to channel his strength into every punch, but this was different. His father was in there, and Isaiah couldn't bear the thought of him suffering in silence. "I just want to see my dad," Isaiah replied, his voice low but steady. He could feel his pulse pounding in his temples, but he forced himself to stay calm, knowing that any sudden reaction would be used against him. But Kent smirked, his eyes gleaming with a dark satisfaction. "Not a chance," he said, his tone condescending. "Your old man's in big trouble, and the last thing he needs is you in there stirring things up." Isaiah's patience snapped, and his voice grew sharper, his words no longer contained. "Big trouble? He hasn't done anything wrong. He's a veteran, for God's sake. He's never hurt anyone in his life." The intensity of Isaiah's words seemed to strike a nerve in Kent. Without warning, he stepped forward, invading Isaiah's space, his expression twisted with contempt. "And what's that supposed to mean? Just because he wore a uniform once, he's untouchable?" Kent's voice grew louder, and Isaiah could feel the shift in the room, the weight of tension building around them. At that moment, Kent's patience wore thin, and his true nature emerged. He shoved Isaiah backward, his hand gripping Isaiah's shoulder with unnecessary force. Isaiah's instincts as a boxer kicked in, his stance shifting as he tried to stay balanced. He didn't want to fight, not here, not now, but Kent seemed to be goading him, daring him to react. "You think you're so tough, huh?" Kent spat, his face inches from Isaiah's. "Just like your dad, always thinking you're better than everyone else, always expecting special treatment." Isaiah took a steadying breath, his fists clenched at his sides. He didn't want to give Kent the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. "Let me see my father," he said, his voice firm but steady. "That's all I'm asking." But Kent merely laughed, his eyes glinting with a cruel satisfaction. "You'll see him when I say so," he retorted, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "Maybe once he's finally admitted what he did." Kent's words hit Isaiah like a punch, the insinuation cutting deep. He wanted to fight back, to shout, to defend his father's name, but he knew that any reaction could lead to something far worse. Still, the anger in his eyes was unmistakable, and Kent, seeing it, felt a surge of superiority. Isaiah tried one last time, his voice laced with desperation. "He's innocent. You know he's innocent. I don't know what kind of grudge you have, but this isn't justice." Kent's expression darkened, and he took a step back, crossing his arms. "You're done here," he said coldly, "and if you don't leave now, you'll be joining him in a cell." Isaiah held his ground for a moment, his eyes locked with Kent's in a silent battle of wills. But he knew that if he stayed any longer, he would only make things worse for his father. He turned to leave, feeling the weight of helplessness settle over him. The world seemed to close in around him as he walked away, his mind racing with the thought of his father alone, trapped in a cell, enduring the same cruelty that Kent had just shown him. Isaiah left the station, but he didn't go far. Instead, he waited outside, pacing the pavement, his heart pounding with frustration and helplessness. The image of his father's face, of the man who had raised him, kept replaying in his mind. He had to find a way to help, to get the truth out, no matter the cost. He wasn't sure how he would do it, but he knew that he couldn't abandon his father now, not when the system that was supposed to protect him had turned against him. Inside the cell, Marcus sat on the cold metal bench, his mind swirling with worry for Isaiah. He knew his son would come for him, but he feared for what he might face, what hostility he might encounter. In his heart, he prayed that Isaiah would stay safe, that he wouldn't suffer the same injustices he had faced. As the hours dragged on, Marcus sat alone in the cold cell, his mind spiraling through the events of the day. He replayed every detail, from the hopeful moment he'd walked into the jewelry store to the split-second flash of violence that had left him bruised and humiliated. He thought about Isaiah, who had always been his pride, a son who'd inherited not just his strength, but also his unyielding sense of justice. The fear that had taken root in his heart now twisted into a deep worry for his son's safety, knowing Isaiah's temper could flare in defense of those he loved. The jail cell was silent, save for the occasional distant shout or the clang of metal from somewhere down the corridor. Time felt meaningless. Hours or days could have passed, and Marcus wouldn't have known the difference. He tried to steady his thoughts, reminding himself of the techniques he'd learned in the service, calming his breathing, visualizing open spaces. But nothing could entirely quell the anxiety coiled within him, the anger at the injustice he'd suffered. He was a decorated veteran, a man who had given years of his life to his country, and yet here he was, treated as less than human, less than worthy. In the dim stillness, the sound of keys jingling down the hall pulled him out of his thoughts. Officer Kent appeared outside his cell, his face shadowed by the dim lighting, his expression unreadable but intense. Kent opened the cell door with a casualness that belied his true intentions, stepping inside and closing the door firmly behind him. Marcus eyed him warily, his guard instinctively rising. There was something ominous in Kent's manner, something that told him this wasn't just another round of questioning. Kent crossed his arms, watching Marcus with a smirk that betrayed his enjoyment of the situation. "It didn't have to be this way, you know," Kent said slowly, his voice low, filled with mockery. "If you'd just cooperated from the beginning, none of this would have happened. You'd have been home by now." Marcus didn't answer, choosing instead to hold Kent's gaze with quiet defiance. He wouldn't give this man the satisfaction of seeing him broken. He'd dealt with people like Kent before, people who thrived on intimidation and power, but in this moment, alone in the cell with no one to witness, he understood that Kent's intent went far beyond punishment. Kent wanted to strip him of his dignity, to make him feel small, powerless. Kent took a step closer, his smirk widening. "I heard your son came down here earlier. You've raised quite a hothead," he sneered. "You know, I could have arrested him too. In fact, I still might if you keep playing this game." The mention of Isaiah was like a trigger, and though Marcus kept his face still, a flicker of anger flashed in his eyes. Kent saw it, and the satisfaction in his expression deepened. Marcus knew what Kent was doing, knew that he was trying to bait him, to provoke a reaction. But the threat to Isaiah was too much. A line crossed, and Marcus felt himself tensing despite his efforts to remain calm. Kent seemed to revel in Marcus's silent struggle, taking another step forward until he was looming over him. "So, here's what's going to happen," he continued, his voice soft but laced with malice. "You're going to admit to what you did in that store. You're going to confess to stealing that diamond ring, and then, maybe, just maybe, I'll forget about that little visit your son paid me." Marcus's pulse pounded in his ears. He'd done nothing wrong, nothing to deserve this treatment. But the thought of Isaiah, of his son being dragged into this, was too much to bear. He'd fought to protect his family, endured hardships, risked his life in service, and now he was being asked to sacrifice his innocence. He was trapped in a horrible reality where truth and integrity meant nothing, where power and prejudice dictated every outcome. Seeing Marcus's hesitation, Kent's expression turned cold. "What's it going to be, Carter?" he taunted, crossing his arms. "Are you really willing to let your son pay for your stubbornness?" The words hit their mark, and Marcus felt the weight of his decision settle heavily on him. He looked down, his fists clenching at his sides. He'd done his best to raise Isaiah right, to teach him strength and resilience, but he couldn't let his son bear the brunt of this injustice. If protecting Isaiah meant sacrificing his own freedom, his own truth, then so be it. Kent sensed his submission and leaned in closer, relishing every second of Marcus's defeat. "I knew you'd come around," he said with a twisted smile. "It's always just a matter of pressure, isn't it?" Marcus swallowed hard, feeling the bitter taste of humiliation wash over him as he nodded slowly. "Fine," he said quietly, barely able to get the word out. "I'll say whatever you want. Just leave Isaiah out of this." The satisfaction on Kent's face was undeniable. He'd won, and he knew it. He stepped back, gesturing for Marcus to stand. Marcus moved slowly, his movements heavy with resignation, each step feeling like a betrayal to everything he stood for, everything he'd ever believed in. Kent led him out of the cell, down a winding hallway, until they reached a dimly lit room where a desk officer was waiting with a blank confession form. Kent nodded to the officer, who handed Marcus a pen, the form resting on the table in front of him. Marcus looked down at the empty lines, his mind numb as he stared at the words printed on the page. Each word he wrote felt like a nail in the coffin of his honor. He could barely keep his hand steady, the pen scraping across the paper as he forced himself to write what Kent wanted to hear. "I took the ring," the words barely legible as he pushed through the shame and frustration. Every letter felt like a lie, yet here he was, forced to play into this falsehood to protect the person he loved most. When he finished, he set the pen down, his hand shaking slightly. Kent picked up the form, looking it over with a pleased expression. "See? That wasn't so hard, was it?" he said, his tone patronizing, as though he'd just taught Marcus a valuable lesson. Without another word, Kent turned and left the room, leaving Marcus sitting alone, his dignity shattered, his sense of self torn apart. He'd spent a lifetime building his name, his integrity, and in one moment, it had all been taken from him. But, even as the bitterness of defeat settled in, Marcus held on to a single thought, the one thread that kept him from succumbing entirely to despair. Isaiah was safe. His son would never have to know the lengths he'd gone to protect him, the sacrifices he'd made in the face of unjust power. The quiet settled around him, the hum of the station filling the air, and Marcus closed his eyes, letting the weight of his decision sink in. He'd chosen to protect his son over his own freedom, his own truth, and while it pained him, he knew he would do it again without hesitation. As he sat there, he couldn't help but hope that somehow, some way, the truth would find a way to rise. But in that moment, as the door to the room remained closed and his future uncertain, Marcus was left with nothing but his sacrifice and the knowledge that he had done what he believed was right, even if the world would never know the cost. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as people gathered to witness the trial of Marcus Carter. News of his arrest had spread, stirring outrage and curiosity in equal measure. Whispers filled the gallery, some questioning the charges, others silently condemning him based on Kent's version of events. On one side sat Marcus's family and a few close friends, their faces etched with worry and disbelief. They'd known Marcus as a man of integrity, a father and veteran who had sacrificed much in his life. Seeing him in this situation felt surreal, like an awful dream from which they couldn't wake. At the defense table, Marcus sat beside his lawyer, a young public defender named Sarah Green. Though relatively new to the courtroom, Sarah had taken Marcus's case to heart, determined to prove his innocence. She had spent countless hours researching, combing through security footage and witness statements, hoping to find some evidence that could clear Marcus's name. But as the trial began, she knew that this case would be an uphill battle. The confession Marcus had signed loomed over them like a dark cloud, casting doubt on his innocence even in the minds of those who wanted to believe him. Officer Kent took the stand first, his demeanor cold and confident. He spoke about the suspicious behavior Marcus had displayed in the jewelry store, painting a picture of a man who had refused to cooperate, forcing Kent to take action. His words were calculated, each sentence crafted to reinforce the image of Marcus as a thief, a man who had no respect for the law. The audience listened in silence, some nodding along, while others exchanged uneasy glances. But beneath Kent's polished words, Sarah sensed something off, an arrogance that betrayed his enjoyment of the situation. As Kent testified, Sarah's mind raced, piecing together every bit of evidence she had, trying to poke holes in his story. But before she could act, Kent mentioned something that took her by surprise: the presence of a young woman in the store. He referred to her only briefly, dismissing her as just another customer, someone who had nothing to do with the incident. But that small detail triggered a memory in Sarah's mind. She remembered a name that had come up in her research: Sophia Marks. Sophia had been listed as a witness, but for reasons unknown, she hadn't been questioned by the prosecution. Sarah's instincts told her that this omission wasn't accidental. During a break, Sarah approached the prosecutor and asked if she could call Sophia Marks as a witness. The prosecutor looked surprised, momentarily thrown off balance. After a brief discussion with the judge, the request was granted, and Sarah quickly sent her team to locate Sophia and bring her to court. When court reconvened, there was a murmur of surprise as Sophia was called to the stand. She looked nervous, shifting in her seat as she faced the gallery, her eyes darting to the floor. The tension in the room was palpable, and Marcus could feel his heart beating faster as he watched this unexpected witness take her place. He didn't know Sophia, but something in her demeanor suggested she held a piece of the truth that had been missing. Sarah approached the witness stand, her voice steady but gentle, hoping to ease Sophia's nerves. "Ms. Marks, thank you for joining us today. Can you tell us what you saw in the jewelry store on the morning of Marcus Carter's arrest? Sophia hesitated, glancing briefly at Kent, whose face remained impassive but watchful. I was there, just looking at some pieces, she began, her voice barely a whisper. I saw Mr. Carter looking at a bracelet, and then I noticed something else. A ring. One of the diamond rings went missing from the display. The courtroom fell silent, everyone hanging on her every word. Sarah leaned in slightly, her tone encouraging. Did you see who took the ring, Ms. Marks? Sophia hesitated again, visibly nervous. Her hands gripped the edge of the witness stand, her knuckles white. She glanced at Kent, who was now staring at her with an intensity that made her visibly uncomfortable. But after a moment, she took a deep breath, gathering her courage. It wasn't Mr. Carter, she said firmly, her voice steadying. I saw someone else. I saw a man in a dark jacket slip the ring into his pocket and leave the store. The gallery erupted in murmurs, disbelief rippling through the crowd. Marcus's family exchanged glances of hope, while Kent's expression hardened. He shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched as he stared at Sophia, his eyes dark with anger. Sarah seized the moment, her voice rising over the commotion. Thank you, Ms. Marks, she said, glancing at the judge before continuing. And can you tell us why you didn't come forward sooner with this information? Sophia looked down, her voice barely audible. I was scared, she admitted. I didn't want to get involved, and when I saw Officer Kent with Mr. Carter, I thought it was safer to stay quiet. Sarah nodded, her gaze shifting to the jury. Thank you, Miss Marks. No further questions. As Sophia left the stand, Sarah could see the impact her testimony had on the jury. They exchanged glances, their expressions conflicted, some visibly doubting Kent's story for the first time. But Sarah knew she needed more. Sophia's testimony was a breakthrough, but it wasn't enough to fully exonerate Marcus. She needed to confront the confession, the document that had cast a shadow over the entire case. Taking a deep breath, Sarah turned to the judge. Your Honor, I would like to recall Officer Kent to the stand for additional questioning. Kent looked surprised, but he made his way back to the stand, his expression guarded. Sarah approached him, her tone sharp and unyielding, a stark contrast to the gentle approach she had used with Sophia. Officer Kent, she began, can you explain to the court the circumstances under which Mr. Carter signed his confession? Kent's face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. Mr. Carter confessed voluntarily, he replied, his tone clipped. He was given the opportunity to speak the truth, and he took it. Sarah nodded, as if considering his words. And did you, or any other officer, use any coercion or threats to obtain this confession? Kent's expression grew colder, and he shifted slightly, his discomfort more noticeable. Absolutely not, he said, his voice edged with impatience. Mr. Carter confessed because he knew he was guilty. Sarah took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. So you're saying that despite Mr. Carter's exemplary military record, despite his years of service, he suddenly decided to turn to theft. And he did so willingly, without any influence from you or your department? Kent's jaw tightened, his gaze hardening as he stared at her. That's correct, he said tersely. Sarah allowed a pause, letting the silence hang in the air before continuing. One more question, Officer Kent. Were you aware that a witness has now testified to seeing someone else take the ring? Someone who left the store before Mr. Carter was even accused? Kent's face paled slightly, a flicker of unease passing over his features. He glanced quickly at the prosecutor, who was watching with a strained expression. I don't recall seeing any other suspects, he said, his voice barely controlled. If there was another person, they didn't come forward at the time. Sarah pressed on, her tone relentless. Or perhaps they didn't come forward because they knew you'd already made up your mind about who was guilty? The tension in the courtroom was electric, every eye fixed on Kent as he struggled to maintain his composure. Sarah's questions had cut through his carefully crafted facade, revealing cracks that were impossible to ignore. The judge, sensing the shift, called a brief recess to allow the jury to process the new testimony. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus's family gathered around him, their expressions a mixture of relief and hope. Isaiah, his eyes filled with pride, squeezed his father's hand, his voice choked with emotion. "We're going to get through this, Dad," he whispered. "The truth is coming out." When court resumed, the mood was different. The jury members returned to their seats with a new perspective, their gazes less certain, their expressions thoughtful. The prosecution's case had taken a blow, and Sarah's persistence had opened a door to doubt that could not be easily closed. In the end, the jury reached a verdict that exonerated Marcus, declaring him not guilty. The courtroom erupted in applause as Marcus embraced his family, tears in his eyes. The weight of injustice lifted, replaced by a sense of relief and gratitude. And as he looked around, he saw not just the faces of those who had believed in him, but also the faces of those who had doubted, realizing that justice had prevailed despite the obstacles. As Officer Kent left the courtroom, his career now tarnished, he cast one last bitter glance at Marcus. But Marcus paid him no mind. He had fought his battle, and he had won, not through anger or revenge, but through resilience and truth. The system had tried to break him, but in the end it was his integrity that had won, shining a light on the darkness of prejudice and abuse of power. After the verdict was read, the tension in the courtroom melted away, replaced by a flood of relief and tears of joy. Marcus's family rushed toward him, their embraces fierce and filled with the emotion of the harrowing ordeal they'd all endured. Isaiah, who had remained strong throughout the trial, finally let his guard down, pulling his father into a hug that spoke of both pain and pride. Marcus returned the embrace, his hand resting on his son's back, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something permanent, a mixture of gratitude, resilience, and triumph that they would carry with them forever. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered, clamoring for a statement from the man who had been at the center of such a controversial and painful case. The courthouse steps were swarming with journalists and onlookers, their faces filled with curiosity and, in some cases, genuine support. But Marcus, drained and weary, had no words left for the press. He wanted nothing more than to leave, to step away from the noise and find solace in the quiet strength of his family. With Isaiah at his side, he moved through the crowd, nodding politely but avoiding eye contact. His thoughts focused on what lay beyond this moment, on the peace he hoped to finally reclaim. As the family reached the edge of the crowd, they were met by Marcus's longtime friend Caleb, a fellow veteran who had been a quiet but constant presence throughout the trial. Caleb extended his hand to Marcus, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding that required no words. Marcus clasped his hand, a silent acknowledgement of their shared history, the battles they'd both fought, both overseas and now here at home. Caleb had known what it meant to be seen as other, to be judged unfairly, and his support had been a steady source of strength for Marcus in these past weeks. The group finally reached Marcus's car, where he took a moment to breathe deeply, the air outside the courthouse feeling fresh and liberating. Isaiah put a hand on his father's shoulder, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "Dad, let's go home. Let's finally put this behind us." Home was a modest house at the edge of town, a place filled with memories and moments shared. The drive back was quiet, each person in the car lost in their own thoughts. Marcus stared out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by, his mind drifting over the events that had unfolded. He thought about the fear, the pain, and the sacrifice he'd been forced to make, but he also thought about the love and loyalty of those who had stood by him. As they turned down the final street, his heart felt lighter, as if some part of his burden had been lifted by the quiet comfort of being among his loved ones. Once inside the house, Isaiah gently guided Marcus to his favorite armchair, urging him to sit down and rest. Marcus sank into the chair, feeling the softness of the worn cushions envelop him, a contrast to the cold metal and concrete of the cell he'd endured. His wife, Helen, brought him a glass of water, her hand lingering on his shoulder as she looked at him with a mixture of relief and love that filled his heart with warmth. They sat together, hands clasped, absorbing the reality that the nightmare was over. In the days that followed, Marcus tried to settle back into a routine, to reclaim the simple pleasures he'd once enjoyed. He took quiet walks in the early mornings, feeling the cool air on his skin, letting the stillness of the dawn ground him. Each step felt like a small victory, a return to the life he'd fought to protect. Isaiah often joined him on these walks, their conversations light and easy, but filled with an unspoken understanding that went beyond words. They didn't need to discuss the trial or the injustice they'd faced. Their presence beside each other was enough. The case, however, had left its mark on the community. Marcus noticed how people looked at him now, their eyes filled with either sympathy or respect, a silent acknowledgement of his ordeal. He'd become a symbol of resilience, of quiet strength in the face of injustice, and while he appreciated the kindness, he also yearned for a return to normalcy, to be seen as simply a man, a father, and a husband, rather than a symbol. Isaiah, too, had been changed by the experience. His bond with his father had grown deeper, and he'd come to understand the true strength that lay in quiet perseverance, in standing firm without compromising one's integrity. He channeled his emotions into his boxing training, using the discipline and focus of the sport to process his feelings, to find a sense of peace. Every punch, every movement was infused with a newfound purpose, a dedication to the principles his father had taught him. Isaiah knew that he was not just fighting opponents in the ring, but also the prejudice and injustice his family had endured. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch, Marcus looked over at Isaiah, his eyes thoughtful. "You know, son," he said, his voice steady but soft. "There were moments when I wanted to give up, when it felt like everything was against us, but knowing you were there, knowing you believed in me, that's what kept me going." Isaiah looked at his father, his expression filled with admiration. "I never doubted you, Dad. Not for a second. You've taught me what it means to stand strong, to keep fighting, no matter how hard things get." Marcus smiled, a quiet pride in his eyes. He reached over, placing a hand on Isaiah's shoulder. "That strength, it's yours now. You carry it forward, for yourself, for everyone who needs to see that standing firm matters." Meanwhile, the aftermath of the trial brought consequences for Officer Kent. The evidence of his abuse of power, his coercion, and his prejudiced behavior had come to light, and the department was forced to take action. Kent faced disciplinary hearings, and as word spread, his reputation crumbled. He was no longer seen as an authority, but as a cautionary tale of what unchecked prejudice could lead to. His career took a hit, his colleagues distancing themselves as the truth of his actions emerged. It was a small victory, a sliver of justice, but it felt like a vindication for Marcus, a reminder that truth, no matter how buried, had a way of coming to light. Over time, Marcus found himself feeling lighter, the weight of the ordeal beginning to fade. He returned to the Veterans Center, volunteering his time to support others who had faced their own battles, both in the field and back home. He shared his story not out of bitterness, but as a testament to resilience, to the strength that lay in integrity and in love for one's family. His presence brought comfort to those around him, a living example of hope and endurance. Isaiah continued to rise in the boxing world, his strength fueled by the lessons he'd learned. With each match, he fought not only for himself but for his father, for his family, for the idea that justice was worth fighting for. And each time he stepped into the ring, he felt his father's spirit beside him, a steadying presence that gave him the courage to keep moving forward. In the quiet moments, Marcus and his family found healing in the simple joys they had missed. They laughed together over meals, sat in silence as the sun set, and shared stories that reminded them of the good times. The ordeal had left scars, but those scars became symbols of survival, of a family that had faced the worst and emerged stronger. As the seasons changed, so did their lives, the pain of the past becoming a distant memory, overshadowed by the strength they'd discovered in themselves and in each other. And though the journey had been long and filled with hardship, they had come through it with a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of justice, and an unbreakable bond that would carry them forward, no matter what lay ahead. In the months following the trial, Marcus's story became a touchstone for the community, a reminder of the deep-rooted issues that lay beneath the surface and the resilience required to confront them. People began to reach out to Marcus, not only to express their support but also to share their own stories of struggle and survival. Slowly, his experience became part of a larger conversation about justice, integrity, and the lingering impact of prejudice on everyday lives. For Marcus, these conversations were bittersweet. While he was grateful for the outpouring of support, he couldn't help but feel a profound sadness for all the people who, like him, had been silenced or sidelined because of unjust systems. Yet, rather than let the bitterness fester, Marcus resolved to channel his pain into something constructive. He began speaking publicly at community events, veteran centers, and schools, his words carrying the weight of his experience, the strength of his character, and a call for understanding and unity. At these gatherings, Marcus often spoke about the principles he held close to his heart: integrity, resilience, and the courage to stand up for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. He told his audience that the hardest battles were often the ones that happened within, the struggles to hold on to one's identity and values in the face of injustice. His words touched many, inspiring people across generations and backgrounds to find strength in their own lives. Isaiah joined him on several occasions, standing proudly by his father's side, adding his own voice to the conversations. His experiences as a boxer, where he had learned to channel anger and frustration into focus and discipline, gave him a unique perspective. He shared stories of training, of learning to pick himself up after every loss, and of his father's influence on his life. Isaiah spoke passionately about the importance of loyalty, family, and the quiet power of endurance. Together, they became a powerful example of a family united in purpose, each supporting the other as they worked toward a future built on understanding and hope. As time went on, Marcus and Isaiah's message reached beyond their immediate community. News outlets picked up their story, highlighting the injustice Marcus had faced and the strength with which he had overcome it. Their story resonated, and soon Marcus found himself invited to speak at events and seminars in neighboring cities and even in other states. Despite the long drives and packed schedules, Marcus accepted these opportunities, seeing them as a way to give voice to those who had suffered silently. Each engagement felt like a small victory, a step toward raising awareness and inspiring others to challenge the biases that festered in the shadows of society. In one particularly memorable speech, Marcus addressed a large crowd of veterans and their families. He shared the anguish he'd felt upon being falsely accused, of the pain that came from having his service and sacrifice disregarded, and of the relief he'd felt upon being reunited with his family. But he didn't stop there. He spoke about the strength that had carried him through, the love of his son and family, and the belief that justice would eventually prevail. His words were met with thunderous applause, and afterward, several people approached him to share their own stories of hardship, of battles both fought and lost. Marcus listened to each one, offering words of encouragement, his presence a testament to the healing power of connection and understanding. In these months of reflection and rebuilding, Marcus found himself changed. He no longer carried the same anger and hurt. Instead, he felt a deep, steady resolve. He wanted to create something lasting, something that could serve as a beacon of hope and guidance for others facing similar struggles. With Isaiah's help, Marcus began organizing workshops focused on conflict resolution, understanding bias, and building community support networks. He partnered with local organizations, veterans groups, and community centers, creating spaces where people could come together, share their experiences, and find strength in their collective resilience. Isaiah, too, found purpose in this new direction. His boxing career took on a new meaning, becoming a platform not only for athletic success but also for advocating the values his father had instilled in him. With each match, he fought not just for victory, but as a symbol of perseverance and the courage to stand up for what was right. His popularity grew, and he became known not only for his skill in the ring, but for his unwavering commitment to justice and integrity. His fans admired him not only as an athlete, but as a young man who had faced and overcome adversity, and who now sought to uplift others through his platform. Isaiah often spoke to youth groups, encouraging young people to find constructive outlets for their anger and frustration. He taught them that true strength lay not in aggression, but in resilience, in the ability to stand firm and refuse to compromise one's principles. He told them about his father's ordeal and how it had shaped his own understanding of what it meant to be strong, to be loyal, and to fight for justice. Isaiah's influence extended far beyond the ring, and he became a mentor to many young people who looked to him for guidance and inspiration. Through their advocacy and outreach, Marcus and Isaiah cultivated a network of support, a community of people who shared their vision of a world built on respect, understanding, and equality. They worked tirelessly, holding events, organizing discussions, and creating resources for those who needed help. They became pillars in their community, their resilience a source of strength for others. Marcus felt a profound sense of fulfillment in this work, a healing that came not just from his own recovery but from the impact he was able to have on the lives of others. As they continued their work, Marcus reflected on the lessons he'd learned through his ordeal. He'd come to understand that justice wasn't always swift or fair, but that it was something worth fighting for. He believed in the power of community, of people coming together to support each other and hold one another accountable. He saw that even in the darkest times there was hope, and that by sharing his story, he could light the way for others. The journey wasn't easy, and the scars of his experience remained both for him and for Isaiah. But they wore those scars with pride, as symbols of what they'd endured and as reminders of the strength they'd discovered in themselves and in each other. They'd transformed their pain into purpose, their anger into action, and in doing so, they had built a legacy that would live on. Years later, as Marcus looked back on this chapter of his life, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had faced the worst, and he had emerged not only intact but stronger. He had fought for justice, for his family, and for the community he cherished. And in the end, he had found a new purpose, a calling that would carry him forward and inspire future generations to stand strong, to believe in justice, and to hold fast to their values, no matter the obstacles they faced. His journey from hope to despair and back to triumph had not been an easy one, but it had been worth it. It was a story of resilience, of a father's love, and of a family that had come together to face adversity head-on. And as he sat with his family, surrounded by the love and laughter they had fought so hard to protect, Marcus knew that in the end, justice had truly prevailed.